Sebastian?
Yeah, well, we are probably the only ones who can openly say which sensor manufacturer we're using and who the other guys are. But honestly, I'm not entirely sure I understand why everybody keeps it so much of a secret. Because you can, if you buy the camera, you can just open it up and you see immediately what sensor is inside. So,
well, you probably know because you
no, but
deal
in any
with
camera, you can buy any camera and look inside, and you can compare it to what's available on the market. And there aren't that many sensor manufacturers that create large diameter sensors in the world. And if you just look at the websites, you can see that's probably the sensor this camera is using. So I guess it comes down to this inaccessibility of the internals of most camera manufacturers, that the sensor is, of course, a very essential component in the image capturing pipeline. Definitely, it's the film stock, as we say now in digital, definitely. But at the times of real film stocks, they even printed the response curves of the different colors on the actual labels of the film stock. And nowadays, nobody's even sharing what sensor they're using. Even that response curve of the sensors could be available. Why isn't anybody sharing that? Everybody can measure it in the end. Why isn't the manufacturer already laying that into the open? And I don't know, maybe we can set an example in that direction at one point. Maybe others will realize that this is an advantage for the customer in the end and not something you're giving away from your own product that you don't want to.
But it's not only about the sensor. I mean, we see, especially with upgrades to camera electronics, like a good example is Canon C100. The first generation uses the same sensor as the second generation, and if you compare, they just use better processing. So if you compare the higher ISOs in the Mark II of the C100, you see there's much less noise than there was in the first generation, which can only be attributed to the processing because the sensor is the same.
Yeah.
So I think that is something that many people overlook, I guess.
There's even more. There's not just the sensor and what you do with the data, there's even the way you treat the sensor, the way you interpret the footage from the sensor. And of course, everybody who's building cameras now wants to keep his advantage in how he's doing it, all the ideas he came up with in doing that to himself, because it's a market advantage, no questions asked, definitely. But the one that's suffering from this kind of, I won't tell you what I'm doing, is the end user, of course. And are there really that many ways or kind of patterns that give you an competitive advantage over the others? I don't know. I think in the end, what we are doing in our cameras is in large parts very similar. And yeah, I hope our approach will kind of open the eyes of the big ones to kind of realize that giving at least some pieces, it can grow over time away from this control or from this kind of shutting off the end user from the product.
Well, I think a lot has changed over the years in general.
Definitely.
I mean, if you think back only a few years ago, before even the RED was around, I think RED definitely changed the market for the better for the customer, because they kind of broke into...
Thankful for kind of starting this revolution and making people aware that they are not 100% dependent on Sony or Canon to make a camera for them. That it's something like this is actually possible now, technically and socially, so to say. But I think there's still a long way to go. But I remember that when we started with the project, open source was something that was common in certain aspects of IT and of web server technology, but in filmmaking it was a very proprietary landscape, and open source was mostly associated with that doesn't work well, or that looks terrible, or the idea behind it wasn't what's driving it, but the impressions people got from bad examples of these kinds of projects. And so a lot of what we were doing and are still doing is making people aware that open source is not a danger. Open source is not destroying the industry or destroying, it's not a business model. Open source is a business model, it's just a different business model. You kind of focus more on services and on customization.
Well, I think from the software industry is a good example. There's a lot of open source operating systems that live well alongside proprietary solutions, and whereas the masses still work with the proprietary solutions, there is very particular uses where open source totally makes sense.